1954, despite the might of the U.S. Navy's finest aircraft, France was unable to stave off a catastrophic defeat in Indochina. At a place called DienBienPhu, all their technological superiority would be shattered. To this day, the Vietnamese speak of DienBienPhu with immense pride, a battle that shook the world and echoed across 5 continents. It was the engagement that annihilated any lingering hope of France, reclaiming its colonial power in the region. How did they fail so spectacularly? And why was America's premier aerial firepower rendered so tragically impotent in French hands? As post-war tensions ignited across Southeast Asia, the United States enacted the Mutual Defense Assistance Act of 1949. For a beleaguered France struggling to retain its grip on Indochina, this act was a lifeline. Seizing the opportunity, the French Aéronaval requested a machine to bolster its aerial dominance, the consolidated PB4Y-2 privateer. In 1950, their request was answered. 22 of these rugged bombers were delivered instantly, becoming the largest and most formidable aircraft in the French arsenal in Indochina, a significant upgrade in firepower and reach. Initially deployed to Tan Son Nhut Air Base outside Saigon, they were entrusted to Flotille 8F, later redesignated 28F, one of France's premier bombing squadrons. Thus, the stage was set. An American submarine hunter, born to patrol the vast Pacific, was now repurposed as a strategic weapon in a desperate colonial conflict. This fateful shift in purpose would cast the privateer in a leading role in one of the most calamitous chapters in French military history. On the afternoon of March 13, 1954, the illusion of French superiority was shattered forever. At precisely 5:00 p.m., a deafening roar echoed across the valley. From hundreds of perfectly camouflaged positions on the surrounding hillsides, Viet Minh artillery opened fire. The French garrison, caught completely by surprise, was engulfed in a storm of steel. The first target was strongpoint Beatrice Him Lam, a key outpost manned by the French Foreign Legion. The barrage was devastatingly accurate and intense, far beyond anything the French had thought possible. At Cat B, the alert sirens blared. The crews of Flotille 28F scrambled to their aircraft. Loaded with a mix of high-explosive bombs and napalm, the privateers flew into the sky, their 4 Pratt Whitney engines thundering as they climbed on course for the distant battle. On board the privateers, the mood was tense but determined. This was the moment they had trained for. Their mission was clear: find the Viet Minh's guns and silence them. As the first privateers arrived over the valley, the pilots began their bombing runs. Believing the Viet Minh's guns to be in crude exposed pits, they descended to a lower altitude for better accuracy. It was the deadliest mistake they could have made. As they leveled out, the sky erupted. They had flown headlong into a wall of flak, a meticulously planned anti-aircraft trap. Dozens of Soviet-supplied 37mm anti-aircraft cannons and hundreds of 12.7mm heavy machine guns, which General Giap's forces had spent months man-hauling into position and concealing in deep, reinforced bunkers, opened up simultaneously. The French pilots were utterly stunned. The air around them became a thick black and red cloud of exploding shells and crisscrossing tracer rounds. The large, slow-moving privateers made for perfect targets. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin like paper. The percussive thump-thump-thump of rounds hitting the fuselage was terrifyingly loud. On one of the first sorties, a privateer was hit hard. Its hydraulic lines were severed and an engine caught fire. Miraculously, the pilot wrestled the crippled giant out of the kill zone and began the long, agonizing flight back to Cat B, a trail of smoke marking its desperate retreat. The debriefings back at base were grim. The shaken crews reported an unbelievable and impossibly dense network of anti-aircraft fire. They had dropped their bombs, but it was like throwing stones into an ocean. The Viet Minh artillery remained largely untouched. That night, under the cover of their relentless artillery, Viet Minh infantry overran strongpoint Beatrice. The nightmare continued. On March 14th, the Viet Minh onslaught shifted to strongpoint Gabrielle. Again, the privateers were called in. Learning from the previous day's horror, they attempted to vary their attack vectors and altitudes, but it was useless. The Viet Minh gunners had the entire valley pre-sighted. The sky above DienBienPhu was no longer a medium for French power. It had become a calculated three-dimensional kill box. The bombing runs were almost completely ineffective against the well-dug-in artillery. The privateers returned to base riddled with holes, their crews demoralized. By the end of March 15th, Gabriel had also fallen. The French High Command's strategy was in ruins, and for the men of Flotille 28F, the war had transformed into a battle for their survival. The initial shock gave way to a grim, grinding reality. The French now understood the lethality of the environment they faced. Daylight bombing runs at low altitudes were suicide. High-altitude bombing, which the privateer was ill-suited for due to its lack of turbo superchargers, was wildly inaccurate against small camouflaged targets. A new desperate tactic was required. They would have to own the night. Thus began the most harrowing phase of the air war. The privateers became nocturnal predators, their missions cloaked in darkness. The new strategy involved a deadly ballet in the sky. A C-47, Dakota nicknamed Luciole Firefly, would fly high over the valley, dropping magnesium flares that bathed the battlefield in a ghostly flickering light. Below, the privateer would circle like a shark, its crews straining their eyes in the dark, searching for the telltale muzzle flash of a Viet Minh gun. Once a flash was spotted, the pilot would have seconds to bank the heavy bomber line up a run and release his bombs before the enemy gunners could track his aircraft's engine noise and fill the sky with predictive fire. The Viet Minh, however, were masters of adaptation. Their anti-aircraft crews didn't just rely on sight. They employed crude but effective acoustic locators to detect the direction of the lumbering bomber's engines. More cunningly, they instituted a decoy system. A single isolated gun would fire a few rounds deliberately, revealing its position. As the French pilot, seeing what looked like an easy target, banked his privateer for an attack, he was being lured into a trap. The main batteries, hidden elsewhere and already tracking his flight path by sound, would unleash a concentrated volley into the darkness, aiming for where the bomber would be in a few seconds. The strain on the French crews was immense. For hours they would fly in the blackness, surrounded by the invisible threat of flak, punctuated by the blinding glare of flares and the sudden terror of an accurate volley. The attritional losses for Flotille 28F were catastrophic. It wasn't just about aircraft being shot down in flames. Many more would limp back to Cat Bai, looking like a honeycomb. Their airframes and control surfaces so thoroughly perforated that they were damaged beyond repair and had to be written off. The squadron was being bled white, not just in machines, but in irreplaceable, highly trained men. Casualties mounted steadily as shrapnel from near misses tore through the unpressurized fuselages. April 25, 1954, marked a particularly dark day for the unit. A privateer on a night mission was caught by a concentrated burst of 37mm fire. It exploded in midair, a brief, horrifying flash in the night sky, taking its entire crew with it. The steel fist was not just failing, it was being systematically broken. By the beginning of May, the French garrison was on the verge of collapse. The airstrip had been destroyed, meaning all supplies and reinforcements had to be parachuted in, and wounded could no longer be evacuated. The defensive perimeter had shrunk to a small shell-pocked pocket around the central command bunker. On May 1st, General Giap launched his final massive offensive. The main targets were the last eastern strongpoints, particularly Elian II, a hill, that became the symbolic bloody heart of the battle's final act. For the air crews, all pretense of tactical caution was abandoned. Their missions became desperate, almost suicidal charges in support of their comrades dying on the ground. The privateers, alongside American-supplied B-26 Invaders and F-6F Hellcats, flew relentlessly into the meat grinder. They no longer had the luxury of hunting for artillery. Their job was now to provide close air support to stop the waves of Viet Minh infantry swarming up the hillsides. Over Hill A1, the privateers unleashed hell. They dropped ton after ton of napalm and high-explosive bombs, turning the slopes into a fiery, smoking inferno. The jellied gasoline incinerated everything in its path, inflicting horrific casualties on the attackers. From the air, it must have looked like they were succeeding, that no human could survive such a holocaust. But the fire and fury could not break the will of the Viet Minh. For every soldier who fell, another took his place, charging through the flames and over the bodies of their comrades. The air support, however brutal, was not enough to stem the tide. The morning of May 7th, 1954, dawned on the final agony of the French garrison. The last privateers still able to fly took to the skies, continuing their attacks with whatever ordnance they had left. One of these bombers, circling high above the devastation, may well have been the last to witness the end. Through breaks in the smoke, its crew would have seen the Viet Minh's red flag with its gold star being raised over General de Castries' command bunker. At 5:30 p.m., the radio crackled with a final somber message. The garrison had surrendered. The battle was over. For the privateers still in the air, the orders were simple and soul-crushing: return to base. Their mission and the entire French endeavor at DienBienPhu had failed. The long, silent flight back to Cat B was the flight of a defeated force. The final accounting for Flotille 28F was grim. Its core mission, the neutralization of Viet Minh artillery, was a 100% failure. It was this failure more than any other single factor that sealed the fate of the French garrison. The cost was staggering. While official records vary, at least 2 privateers were confirmed shot down with their entire crews lost. More devastating was the attritional toll. A staggering 14 other aircraft were so heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire that they were written off, effectively destroyed. In just 56 days, the squadron had lost the majority of its operational strength. The human cost in killed and wounded among its elite veteran crews was a blow from which the Aéronaval in Indochina would not recover. So why did the steel fist shatter? The disaster was the result of a perfect storm of 3 converging factors, a failure that would be debated and dissected for decades in the halls of French power. First and foremost was a profound and systemic French hubris. The High Command's entire strategy was built on a foundation of colonial arrogance and a catastrophic underestimation of their enemy. They could not conceive that a peasant army could possess the logistical prowess, technical skill, and strategic brilliance to deploy and sustain a sophisticated, integrated air defense network in such a remote location. This lack of foresight became their Achilles heel. They planned a battle against the enemy they wanted to fight, not the enemy that was meticulously preparing to annihilate them. This strategic blindness manifested in a series of disastrous tactical errors. The French command was caught completely off guard by the sheer scale and effectiveness of Viet Minh artillery, particularly their 105mm cannons, which encircled the stronghold and held the high ground. By choosing DienBienPhu, the French had inadvertently handed the Viet Minh's artillery the perfect killing field. The mistakes compounded. In one of the gravest errors of the campaign, reinforcements were parachuted directly into the basin, a strategy meant to bolster the garrison, but which in reality fed fresh troops directly into the Viet Minh's meat grinder. A more sound strategy would have been to drop them outside the valley to create a diversion and attack Giap's forces from the rear. But this was never attempted. It was a strategy, as one French general later admitted, that was utterly disastrous from a military standpoint. This was all part of General Navarre's flawed decision to deploy troops to a remote, isolated area, completely dependent on an air bridge that he failed to adequately protect. Second was the undeniable genius of the Viet Minh, a factor the French leadership only truly appreciated in their memoirs decades after the fall. In stark contrast to the French, whom Navarre later described as an alliance of national interests that were, if not contradictory, then divergent in their objectives, the Viet Minh possessed an unwavering belief. Formidable determination, dynamic energy, and complete unity between strategic direction and operational execution. General Giap and his staff orchestrated one of the most brilliant logistical and tactical feats in modern military history. They didn't just bring guns to the fight. They brought them in, secretly dug them into virtually impregnable positions, and employed them with lethal discipline and adaptive tactics that consistently outthought their technologically superior foe. For the Viet Minh, this was a people's war fought with total commitment. For the French, it was a half-hearted conflict, whereas Navarre lamented, no one even bothered to explain why French soldiers were fighting. The Viet Minh army was highly mobile and adaptable, while the French, though stronger on paper, paid a heavy price for their cumbersome approach and failure to adapt to the land and people of the region. They turned the valley's terrain, a perceived weakness, into their greatest strength, creating the ultimate flak trap. Finally, the PB4Y-2 privateer was tragically the wrong tool for the job, a problem symptomatic of a much larger logistical failure. It was a magnificent maritime patrol bomber, designed for long, lonely hours over open ocean. It was never intended to be a ground attack aircraft in a high-threat environment. Its large size, relatively slow speed, and poor maneuverability made it a predictable target. Most critically, its unsupercharged engines robbed it of the ability to operate at altitudes that might have offered some protection from the deadly 37mm cannons. This weakness was compounded by a broader problem, one that the Americans themselves criticized. Indochina lacked the necessary ground infrastructure, such as properly planned airfields, to support large-scale modern aircraft, even if the U.S. had provided a fleet of more advanced planes. The French lacked the prepared facilities and trained pilots to operate them effectively. It was a World War II weapon, supported by a deficient logistical system thrown into a new kind of war, and it was found wanting. The fate of the privateer at DienBienPhu is a brutal lesson in the limitations of air power. It proved in the most visceral way possible that aerial supremacy is not a magical guarantee of victory. A determined, intelligent, and well-prepared ground force can and will find ways to negate that advantage. The image of the once mighty privateers riddled with holes and burning in the jungle served as a dark prophecy. In the aftermath, the search for truth quickly devolved into a bitter hunt for scapegoats within the French political and military establishment. Officers clashed with Generals Navarre and Cogny, publicly blaming each other for the cascade of failures. The French government, facing a crisis of confidence, established a secret investigative commission, whose findings were concealed for 50 years, only being declassified in 2005. To protect the political elite, its conclusions were not overly harsh. Focusing on tactical military errors, General de Castries for violating fundamental principles, General Cogny for failing to manage reserve forces, and General Navarre for dispersing his troops. Yet, these were merely symptoms of a much deeper disease. It was a lesson in humility that France learned at a terrible cost, and a lesson the United States, blinded by its own technological confidence, would have to relearn in the same skies just a decade later. Perhaps the most honest assessment came from the French themselves. Long after the recriminations had faded, a final haunting admission of their core failure. We always underestimated the Viet Minh, both politically and militarily. Their prestige and influence among the people, their spirit dynamism, and the military prowess of their commanders were far beyond what we imagined. The privateer didn't just fail to save the French at DienBienPhu. Its spectacular demise symbolized the very collapse of their colonial dream. The consolidated PB4Y-2 privateer is not weak. Perhaps it would be more effective when used on other battlefields, by other people, or used for more humanitarian purposes. The evolution of military aircraft often follows necessity, and the PB4Y-2 privateer exemplifies this principle perfectly. Born from wartime, demands this naval patrol bomber, transformed from an adapted Army design into a specialized maritime warrior. By September 1942, the U.S. Navy began utilizing the Army's B-24 Liberator bombers, designated PB4Y-1, for critical maritime patrol missions. While these borrowed bombers performed admirably, they weren't optimized for naval operations. Consequently, in 1943, the Navy approached Consolidated Aircraft for a purpose-built patrol bomber based on the B-24 design. The development process moved swiftly. The first XPB4Y-2 prototype conducted initial test flights in late 1943, still sporting the distinctive twin-tail configuration of its B-24 ancestor. Production versions began arriving in March 1944, with squadrons VPB-118 and VPB-119 receiving their aircraft by late 1944 and deploying to the Pacific Theater in January 1945. Although clearly descended from the B-24, the PB4Y-2 privateer featured substantial modifications tailored specifically for maritime operations. Most visibly, engineers replaced the Liberator's twin vertical stabilizers with a single tall tail fin, improving stability at the lower altitudes typical of naval patrols. The fuselage underwent significant extension, stretched approximately 8 feet longer, creating space for a dedicated flight engineer station. This addition reduced pilot fatigue during the extended over-water missions, central to the aircraft's role. Defensive capabilities received considerable enhancement. With armament increased to 1250 caliber, Browning machine guns distributed across 6 power-operated turrets. The distinctive teardrop-shaped Airco waist turrets could be deflected downward to converge their firepower 30 feet below the aircraft, while the B-24's ventral ball turret was eliminated. Furthermore, the engineers made a crucial power plant modification. Unlike the high-altitude-focused B-24, the privateer utilized non-turbocharged Pratt Whitney R1830-94 engines, 1,350 horsepower, optimized for efficient operation at lower patrol altitudes. This change sacrificed high-altitude performance unnecessary for maritime patrol, while enhancing the aircraft's efficiency in its intended role. At the outbreak of World War II, the Navy faced a significant capability gap. It lacked long-range land-based patrol bombers necessary for conducting search anti-submarine and anti-shipping missions. Initially, the Navy acquired Army B-24s as PB4Y-1s starting in September 1942, primarily to address the urgent need for aircraft capable of extended range operations, particularly in Arctic and northern wintertime environments. The operational realities of naval patrol missions specifically differed substantially from the Army's strategic bombing role. Maritime patrols typically operated at lower altitudes, often as single aircraft rather than in formations, and required specialized equipment for tracking submarines and vessels. Additionally, these missions demanded extended flight times over vast stretches of open ocean. The PB4Y-2 addressed these needs through its enhanced crew accommodations, state-of-the-art search radars, and navigation equipment, providing all-weather capability. The increased defensive armament proved essential for solo aircraft, operating far from friendly support, while the modified engines delivered better performance in the maritime patrol envelope. By war's end, the Navy had taken delivery of 739 privateers, which would continue serving through the Korean War and beyond, fulfilling the specialized maritime patrol role for which they were designed. Throughout the final stages of World War II, the PB4Y-2 privateer established its reputation as a versatile maritime patrol aircraft, ultimately serving far beyond its intended wartime role. The Pacific Theater became the proving ground for the newly deployed privateers in early 1945. Patrol bomber squadrons 118 and 119, VPB-118 and VPB-119 pioneered operations with these aircraft, with VPB-118 beginning the first overseas deployment on January 6, 1945. Soon after VPB-119 initiated offensive search missions from Clark Field in the Philippines on March 2, 1945, conducting sectored searches extending from the Gulf of Tonkin along the Chinese coast and beyond Okinawa. These massive patrol bombers demonstrated remarkable endurance, often flying missions lasting up to 16 hours. Their operational scope expanded beyond basic patrol duties to include search and rescue operations, electronic warfare, and weather reporting. Moreover, the PB4Y-2 proved its combat effectiveness when VP-24 employed the revolutionary ASM-N2 BAT radar-guided bombs against Japanese shipping, with some strikes occurring at standoff distances up to 23 miles from their targets. The price of combat operations proved steep between October 1944 and August 1945. A total of 61 privateers were lost to all causes. Nevertheless, by war's end, several squadrons were conducting operations spanning from the Philippines to the Aleutian Islands. Following World War II, the privateer's versatility secured its continued service in increasingly specialized roles. From 1945 through the mid-1950s, these aircraft became essential as typhoon and hurricane hunters. Tragically, this dangerous mission claimed lives, including one aircraft, PB4Y-2 59415, lost while investigating a Category 1 typhoon near Bataan Island in the Philippines. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, privateers took on a crucial signals intelligence mission. Flying what were termed ferret missions, these aircraft monitored electronic signals along Soviet and Chinese coastlines. This dangerous work led to a significant Cold War incident on April 8, 1950, when Soviet Le-11 fighters shot down a U.S. Navy PB4Y-2 privateer over the Baltic Sea near Latvia, resulting in the loss of all 10 crewmen. The Korean War's outbreak in June 1950 brought privateers back into combat operations. Naval squadrons flew offshore patrols searching for North Korean and Chinese seaborne infiltrators. Additionally, PB4Y-2s performed vital firefly and lamplighter night illumination missions, dropping parachute flares to support marine night attack operations. Despite these dangerous assignments, the aircraft occasionally faced direct threats. In 1952, Chinese MiG-15s attacked two PB4Y-2s patrolling off China's coast, though both aircraft managed to escape. Under the Mutual Defense Assistance Act, signed in 1949, the United States transferred numerous military aircraft to Allied nations. Notably, France received 22 PB4Y-2 privateers for deployment with their colonial forces in Vietnam. The French Aéronaval assigned these aircraft to Flotille 28F, based at Tan Son Nhut, near Saigon. Unlike their American counterparts, who primarily used the aircraft for patrol missions, the French employed privateers as conventional bombers throughout their conflict in Indochina. Furthermore, these aircraft supported ground operations during the critical Battle of DienBienPhu. After France's defeat at DienBienPhu, 6 privateers returned to America, while the remaining aircraft transferred to North Africa. There they continued combat operations against Algerian independence fighters and participated in the 1956 Suez Crisis before being replaced by Lockheed P-2V6 Neptunes in the early 1960s. In the end, the story of the consolidated PB4Y-2 privateer at DienBienPhu is a tragedy written in 3 distinct acts of a colonial arrogance that blinded a nation to the reality on the ground, of a revolutionary genius that turned a jungle valley into a fortress of ingenuity and will, and of a machine of war powerful in its own right, forced into a battle it was never designed to win. The privateer itself became more than just a casualty of war. It became a monument to a fatal underestimation. Its smoking wreckage in the Vietnamese highlands was not merely a testament to the Viet Minh's sophisticated air defenses, but a symbol of a dying empire's flawed strategy. It served as a grim prophecy of conflicts to come a brutal lesson in the limits of air power that France learned in blood, and one that the United States tragically would have to learn all over again in the very same skies. The once proud hunter of the vast Pacific met its end, not at the hands of a rival navy, but in a suffocating valley brought down by the unshakable will of a people fighting for their homeland. Ultimately, the disaster of the privateer was not the failure of a machine, but the catastrophic failure of an empire.